Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday the 20th of December, and you are watching episode 117 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, A Drop in the Ocean, What Can It Reveal?, is my guest, Dr. Peter Ridd, physicist and former head of physics and marine geophysics laboratory at James Cook University. Peter was born in Devon, England, and moved to Innisfail, far north Queensland, at the age of 10. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in physics from James Cook University and a diploma education from the University of Queensland. Peter started his working career as a teacher at the historic independent educational institution that is the Blackheath and Thornburn College in Charters Towers. He returned to studies and obtains his PhD in physics. During this period, Peter joined the Australian Institute of Marine Science. He started studying the Great Barrier Reef in 1984, mainly focusing on ocean currents and the movement of sediment. Peter went on to be the head of marine geological physiological laboratory at the physics department in JCU, Townsville. His consultancy work while at the university resulted in the development of specialist instrumentation for the measurement of water quality. The commercialization of this technology provided income and profits used to fund student scholarships and research projects. Peter has published more than 100 papers in international science journals and supervised many successful PhD students. The public airing of his concern as to the quality of marine science data has led to his dismissal in 2016. Today, Peter is an independent consultant and fellow of the Australian Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm sort of surprised in regards to when we think about physics, we think about Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper, rockets, all that sort of thing. We don't sort of think as physicists in marine environment in regards to what's really most people think is the domain of marine biologists. So can you give us a bit of an idea how a physicist fits into marine industry?
Well, you're right. Most people think if you work in marine science, then you're a biologist. But actually, there's physics, there's chemistry, there's geology, and yes, there's biology. The biology is probably why you ultimately want to do stuff. But physics is in everything. It doesn't matter what it is, it's there. So a marine physicist like myself would work on movement of water, the tides, the currents, the way that the heat goes into the ocean from the sunlight, how it's lost by evaporation, turbulent diffusion. There's all the modeling of the ocean currents. These are all physics things. And if you want to measure something like the water quality, where you're often using optics and electronics, then you need physics and you need engineering and you use mathematics. And in fact, there's not enough of these hard scientists in the marine sciences. There's far too many of the biologists, many of whom are frankly emotional about the Great Barrier Reef, which you can understand. But you've just got to remember that there's physics, geology, chemistry, and the biology there.
So in a broad look, when you're doing physics, it's very much have a problem, get information, sort it all out, and then go through it, bit by bit under all the different scientific laws and experiments you can do to get an outcome. So it's a fairly strong discipline requirement in that. Where is that the issue between having that physicist side of it versus just the marine biology, where it's just look at the picture and come up with some sort of mental output of it?
I think that one of the reasons that I am a contrarian about the Great Barrier Reef, I believe the Great Barrier Reef is in very good shape, it's not in a bad shape, is from that physics background. It's not the only thing. I know lots of biologists who also believe the Great Barrier Reef is in a good shape, but they tend to be very precise thinkers. Now, one of the things about physics is that, you can usually you can describe things with simple mathematical equations. They may not look simple to a non-physicist, but they are actually incredibly simple. And it's that ability to distill things down to the fundamental level that is a difference often between a physicist and a biologist. But then, of course, the geologists are really important because they put everything in a much longer perspective. And that's another thing where physicists are not necessarily very good at, and biologists are often not very good at that. So you need all the major disciplines to describe the ocean. It's almost obvious that you do.
But do you think sometimes there's a bit of conflict in regards to, well, you're coming up with this idea because you're a geologist and you're saying, right, 2,000 years ago with the sea levels were higher and this is all not relevant in your biology, and because other things happen, and then there's other people who have got conflicting views. So how do you sort of get them as, or individual disciplines, to work together and for a choice of a better word, be honest with each other in regards to the importance of the field and the importance of the data they're supplying?
Well, I don't think it does work anymore. I mean, one of the things which I used to, moan about with my geologists, so I'm a physicist, but I worked a lot with geologists, is that if you go back to the 1990s, there were a lot of geologists, there was quite a few physicists working in the Great Barrier Reef sort of area. And on many of these issues, we were a very effective foil to the catastrophism that was always coming out of the biology departments. Now, what's happened in the last 20 to 30 years is that the number of non-biologists has just almost gone to nothing. So there's almost no geologists now working on the Great Barrier Reef, and that's a real problem. And there's not a great number of physicists. So you now have a large number of biologists who actually, frankly, have no idea about the physics or the chemistry of the biology or the geology of the Great Barrier Reef, and that's a real problem because they just don't have all the cards in the deck to be able to describe it properly, and they get carried away with their emotion and their catastrophism all the time.
I think the other thing that sort of astounds me is the fact that they don't sort of reference that the environment's always changing, and the Great Barrier Reef, when the Indigenous people first turned up, was part of mainland Australia. They were outcrops just out there. The shore was about 40 kilometres out or more, and then we had the situation where we went into a interglacial period, and the sea level rose, and the Great Barrier Reef re-established itself. So there's, to a layman like me, I suspect that this is probably the 10th or so reincarnation of the Great Barrier Reef in the last 800,000 years.
Exactly. And, when the Aboriginal people arrived 40, 50, 60, whatever thousand years ago, the reef was just a sequence of 3,000 flat top hills somewhere, off to the east. It wasn't just 40 kilometers. In some places, it's, 120, almost 200 kilometers. And then they got flooded as the sea level rose. But even over shorter periods of time, most biologists have no idea that the sea level has fallen by about 1 meter in the last 5,000 years on this coast, which means that the tops of many of these 3,000 reefs are now exposed at low tides, where 5,000 years ago they weren't. And there's nothing that kills coral more than exposure, long period of exposure to the air. So the ignorance of these long-term changes that the geologists describe is a real problem. And I can, even the coastal reefs, the inshore reefs, which really aren't the Great Barrier Reef at all, these are coming and going. So there's a new reef just offshore from Townsville that only started about 1,000 years ago. On the other hand, there are almost certainly some reefs near Cape Cleveland which have been completely covered with sediment from the Burdekin River, because the Burdekin River has been changing its outlet by up to 10 to 40 kilometers every 1,000 years. So there's these monumental changes that are occurring over hundreds and thousands of years. And the tiny little changes that the biologists are often describing should be put in that context, and they shouldn't necessarily be ascribed to humans when actually this is just the change that always occurs.
I think that's one of the other things. It's though there's an expectation put across to normal people in the street that everything should be a constant, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, the barrier reef, we've got to save it, we've got to keep it as it is, no matter what. Yet, and they don't give any credence to the fact there are fluctuations, and there always will be fluctuations. So we just deal with what we can at this point in time, and do the best we can. But we can't just, you know, get another $1 billion and of taxpayers' money and throw. Oh, go and do a bit more research. I mean, I dread the more money being thrown at the reef when there's other priorities around, like hospitals, ambulances, and things like that. But we can seem to come up with another $1 billion, and that was part of the reason I contacted you, because Tanya Plibersek came out with in about August with a media release saying they're allocating more money to the reef to satisfy the requirements of UNESCO, and talking in the vicinity of $1.2 billion, and then getting these independent people, and I query independent people when you talk about Mr. Chubb from CSRO,
Yeah.
just as I balk at people saying we're having have an independent review on the Bradfield scheme when it's run by people like Gaunt, what's his name? Gaunt, who's, you know, been a greenie all his life, sort of thing. So it is a little bit worrying when the government picks on these independent experts to reign over things. And then just before in December, we just learnt there's another $50 million. Sometimes we don't understand whether it's money that's already been allocated at 1.2, but to give to people to do planting and other restoration in creeks and things. So how effective are we spending that money, taxpayers' money?
I think we get about 10% of the value of what we spend. So I estimate we spend each year, if you add up everything, not just these government grants, but what goes for AIMS, Great Barrier Reef Park Authority, all the university research, all the land care groups, which now have a huge Great Barrier Reef focus. You add all that up, somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion every year, year in, year out, right? So, and I reckon we get about 10% of that value. Where is that value? Well, it's not on the reef, because the reef is fine, okay? It's got record amounts of coral. In the last 2 years, we've never had more coral in the past than we've got in the last 2 years, which is proof that the reef is fine, okay? Now, some of that money is being spent on some useful things on the land to reduce soil erosion, and reducing soil erosion is always a good thing. But, you know, the coral reef planting, that's just a waste of time. The reef itself produces trillions and trillions of larvae every year, and any area that can possibly grow coral is growing coral right now. If you sink a boat somewhere out on there on the reef, it will grow coral, right? You don't have to plant it. It will just grow all by itself. So they're wasting money on that. They're wasting money on crown of thorns starfish, which is another natural phenomenon. There's a whole lot of other areas where they're wasting money. They're even talking about making clouds to protect the coral from bleaching, to stop the sunlight getting in. Some of it is utterly mad stuff. But I reckon some of the stuff there, you know, down near Bowen, where there's a lot of soil erosion because of past practices where we probably have hammered the land a bit too hard, that is probably useful stuff. But, you know, 10%, I reckon, is probably about it.
Well, there's a lot of money that could be directed otherwhere more usefully. Just in regards to the inner reefs and that, why is there any attention given to them, and why does the boundary of the barrier reef sort of probably should be shifted out to sea a little bit to be a bit more fair on on people on the land instead of trying to save these impossible little reefs?
Yeah, no, so for your viewers, the Great Barrier Reef is 3,000 reefs, which are all offshore. You know, the nearest one's probably 20 to 30 kilometers offshore. Most of them are sort of like 50 kilometers offshore, and some of them are up to 200 and even 250 kilometers offshore. But there's these tiny little reefs that sit on the rocks close inshore in a few places. And these are the inshore reefs. And they often call them the inshore Great Barrier Reef, but they're not the Great Barrier Reef. They are inshore reefs, and they're in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, but they're not Great Barrier Reef. And of course, these are the ones that are affected by river runoff. Now, the work that we did on the sediments has proven that they're not actually affected to any extent by the river runoff. They get far more sediment from natural resuspension by waves. But even if they were, they barely 1% of the coral that's on the Great Barrier Reef, and they're not the Great Barrier Reef, and they're actually doing okay. So if those inshore reefs are doing pretty well, then how can the Great Barrier Reef, which is, over the horizon, literally way over the horizon, how can they be affected by runoff from farming?
So the John Brewster Reef, that got a little bit of publicity in the last few years. That's an inshore reef?
No, John Brewer, no. John Brewer is I would call that a mid-shelf reef.
Yep.
It's about 60 kilometers offshore, something like that. That's the closest reef to Townsville, right? That's the closest reef from the Great Barrier Reef to Townsville. So it's a fair bit further than, say, Green Island is from Cairns. But then the final reefs on the outer edge of the continental shelf would be another 40 kilometers further offshore. Now, John Brewer Reef is in wonderful condition. There's adrenaline dive goes out there every few days, and you can see the most spectacular coral on John Brewer Reef. You go back 15 years, maybe don't hold me to that exact date, but certainly a decade or two. John Brewer Reef was a wasteland, okay? The crown-of-thorn and starfish plagues had gone through. Maybe it had been smashed by Cyclone Yasi or whatever. So it goes through these huge cycles, but at the moment it's at the top of a really good cycle. But you've got to expect that maybe in another 10 years, it will look like a wasteland again, but it will come back because that's what the reef just does. It's like bushfires on land. Sometimes it looks terrible, but it always comes back.
Just on that, with the John Brewer Reef being the closest one to Townsville, that would then be the closest to the Burdekin plume.
Not quite.
No, that's you're down the air. Burdekin's a bit down the air.
That's right. But the closest to the Burdekin is Stanley Reef and Old Reef, I think it is. And we went out to Stanley Reef. There's a great charter that goes out to Stanley Reef from the mouth of the Burdekin. We went out there last year. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Now, it actually got affected by a Burdekin plume, which just reached it. And of course, the pictures went all around the world. The measurements show there was basically stuff or sediment in it. There was a bit of discoloration of the water because water that flows off the land is a little bit like tea. It's got all the dissolved tannins from all the leaves and vegetable matter. So it looked much worse than it actually was. But it had absolutely no effect on the coral. It probably had a beneficial effect, actually. And that reef is in wonderful, wonderful condition. And by the way, both John Brewer and Stanley were supposedly hugely affected by bleaching in the last few years. So they've gone through all these supposedly catastrophes and they've got wonderful amounts of coral. So go figure. That just tells you that the scientists have essentially been, exaggerating isn't the right word. They've just been telling things which aren't true about these reefs.
I'll just chuck up a screenshot. And this is from your friend Jennifer Mararosi. And this is out on the John Brewer Reef. And it's an interesting concept in regards to people taking photographs underwater and not having reference. So you can make something look really bad if you don't have a color reference. And one of the things she was sort of innovative about with her photography recently is having a color chart, so you get a reasonable true reflection of what's going on there, against a colour chart.
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer's done some really good work there. I mean, these color charts have been around for a long time, so it's not like this isn't well known. But you know, one of the things that Jennifer says is that, which is absolutely right, is that some of the scientists, they fly over the reef at 200 miles an hour and, I don't know, 150 meters height or something, look down and say, oh, the reef is bleached. But you can't really see a great deal. You can only see the top just few meters of water, and even there it's hard to tell. She said you really got to get into the water and match the colors, and you'll often find corals that are quite white. They may look bleached, but they're not. You can, on other occasions, find corals that are bright as anything, and they are bleached, okay? And the funny thing is that they're often the most bright and colorful when they're actually under stress. So it's rather interesting that these things happen. But what we were told about John Brewer Reef, and it went right around the world, was complete garbage, all right? It was just utter garbage. They said it was massively bleached. It was, it was never meant to be like this. But now, there was a little bit of coral loss from it, but heck, where is a forest that doesn't have a dead tree? I should be able to go out to the Great Barrier Reef and find the odd dead bit of coral, you would think. And you do, but you also find spectacular coral, spectacular fish. This is what it should be like, and it is like that.
But the only thing that guarantees you more supply of money is dead coral, not...
Yes, and of course you can always find dead coral. Now, this is one of the crucial things about why such scandalous mistruths are told about the reef. You can't see it, okay? Most people, even along this coast, as you know, probably go out to the reef once or twice in their lifetime, all right? And you see a couple of acres of reef, and that's it, because it's covered underwater and it's a long way from the coast. So scientists can easily come and say, oh, the Great Barrier Reef's lost half of its coral. Now, if they said that the Blue Mountains west of Sydney had lost half of their trees, right? People in the western suburbs will look off to the west and they'll hop in their car and say, well, no, it hasn't. The Blue Mountains are still covered with trees, so they'd never get away from that with that. But you can get away with it with the Great Barrier Reef because almost nobody visits it. Of the 3,000 reefs, probably tourists only see maybe half a dozen or a dozen, and they only see a very small fraction. So I'll tell you an interesting story. When we went out to John Brewer Reef, there was I think he was a Portuguese guy who was working on the boat, and he was saying, oh, John Brewer Reef is really, really, really good at the moment. And some of the tourists were saying, oh, but I'd heard the reef was really bad. And he said, yeah, well, I've heard that some of the reefs further to the north are not so good. So even this guy who was seeing the reef at its best, well, he'd heard that, well, maybe some of these reefs which are underwater that nobody's visiting, maybe they're the ones that are in poor shape. So you can get away with all sorts of mistruths about the reef because you can't see it. Even satellite photographs, you just get the vague outline. You can't tell how much coral is there. So when one of these institutions and scientists come along and say, we've lost half the coral, as they often do, we've lost half the coral about 10 times since I've been working on the reef. We should have zero coral. They get away with it because there's too few people who can actually contradict them.
But the other thing is that a lot of people who want to believe it and promulgate it because it suits their narrative and it suits them winning votes or influence in major cities.
Well, there's certainly some politicians who make use of that. There's certainly some scientists who are higher up in the institution who recognize quite fully that, if you were the head of a big institution or studying the reef, you've got 100 people working underneath you. They've all got mortgages. Their kids are going to school. You want to make sure they've got a job. So you just bang the drum and make sure the money still keeps coming in for the people who are working for you. You can't blame them for doing that. But you've also got, and this is in defense of some of the scientists, I think a lot of them are very emotional about the reef, which you can understand because it's so beautiful. So when they do see the reef go through a low patch where it does get, completely smashed by a cyclone or eaten by a crown of thorns starfish, or even lose a little bit of coral from bleaching, they look at this and think, oh, this is the end of the world. I mean, that's the way I feel when I see a forest that's been burned. It's sort of, it's hard not to be depressed about it under those circumstances. So if they're not very objective, if they're emotional, if they're talking to other emotional people, and there's this almost this pressure to push the catastrophism, it's almost inevitable that we've got what we've got, especially as the reef basically can't be seen by most people.
I think one of the other things is too, with climate change and that, we had the polar bear as the poster figure sort of thing of catastrophism, and the polar bear was going to die, but it refused to die. It's refused to go extinct, and it's making a fairly big comeback. And it usually can when you stop shooting them anyway, and you bring in a bit of protection. But you know, there's a lot of publicity about that. Do you think the Great Barrier Reef became a focus because the polar bear wasn't doing the right thing by catastrophism?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, the Great Barrier Reef has supposedly been dying since the 1960s, even before the climate stuff got going. Okay, you know, when Robert Endine said it was all being eaten by crown of thorn starfish, it was going to be dead within 10 years. I remember when I was, you know, when we arrived in Australia when I was 10 years old in Innisfail, I was hearing that, well, the reef is gone. You know, it's within 10 years, it'll all be gone. Right. This was in 1971 or something. And it's just gone on since then. It's just convenient. You see, polar bears work because, well, you got climate change, the ice caps are melting, therefore this must be bad for polar bears, right? It sort of makes sense. With the Great Barrier Reef, well, they're right. Sometimes a whole lot of coral dies. You know, you can lose half the coral on, you know, probably 400 or 500 reefs simultaneously. But what they never tell you about is, well, yeah, but it regrows again. So, but because you've got these periods where it undoubtedly does lose a lot of coral, that's great for selling the story to people in England or America or wherever that the reef is going to be a catastrophe. It's not until you get people of my age that have been through, I've heard this so many times before, is this right? But the young people coming through, they haven't heard it before. They think it really is the end of the world, that not only is the reef going to be eaten like I thought when I was 10, but the polar bears are gone too, and everybody else.
You're just saying that the extent of the reef coral is pretty good near records. Can some of that be attributed to the fact that we've had a La Nina for the last 3 years, which is an unusual cycle, or that hasn't got an La Nina? El Nino is not a overdriving factor.
No, it's not a huge factor. I mean, it does in the sense that if you get cyclones are the big killer, right? Cyclones, number one killer of coral. The waves from a cyclone, so the wind causes huge waves, which will smash coral down to, you know, 20, 30, even 40 meters depth, right? So if a cyclone goes over a reef, it's pretty well obliteration for all the fragile coral, all the branching and staghorn coral, all the plate coral, pretty well gone, unless it's managed to be tucked behind some, you know, bit of the reef. The big parietes, the big block coral will survive, but that's only maybe 10% of the coral. Now, the reason we've done so well is we haven't really, apart from Cyclone Debbie, which was a big one, went through the Whitsundays, but it didn't get much coral because it went straight across the reef. But Cyclone Hamish in 2000 and, oh gosh, 9, 10, 11, something like that, it took out the bottom third of the reef, basically the whole lot, right? Because the track went straight down the bottom third of the reef and it took out that third. So we hit rock bottom in 2011, 12, somewhere like that, and we're recovering from that. We've also been lucky in the sense that the crown of thorns starfish plagues, which are entirely natural, for some reason, they haven't been so bad in the last few years as they were, you know, maybe in the early 2000s. So those things together mean we're doing really well, but you can be sure that in a few years' time, it will go down. And all the catastrophists will say, we've lost half the coral on the Great Barrier Reef. And they'll be right. We will have lost half of it. But they forget to mention that we've been here before, guys. It will grow back.
Is it the fact that we can't seem to accept things that are cyclic? We just expect everything to be on a flat plane. We can't accept this up and down sort of situation.
I think people can. They're just not told. And this is one of the corruptions of the scientific institution. They're not corrupt in the financial and they're not necessarily deliberately lying. But they're not telling us the fact that these reefs are very, very cyclical systems, and just get over that and don't get too depressed when we go down. It's actually an indication of a really healthy ecosystem, that it can bounce back, actually. If you have a fire goes through, like there's a 40-mile scrub, towards Mount Surprise from here, from the Tablelands. It had a big fire go through because they hadn't done the burning, the continuous burning. And after that fire went through, all that has come back is lantana and weeds. Now, that is an ecosystem which has been destroyed on the land by poor fire management practice, right? On the reef, though, when these cyclones go through, we come back with, almost bigger and better corals, right? We don't have that wipeout of the ecosystem. A sick ecosystem can't recover. 40-mile scrub west of here, it's a sick ecosystem and it didn't recover, but the reefs are. And talking about those ecosystems, why aren't we spending part of that 500 million a year fixing up the completely broken fire management regimes, which has now obliterated one of the real gems of botany in North Queensland, which is the 40-mile scrub, which has been basically almost lost, or at least large fractions of it have been effectively lost.
Well, sometimes I think in regards to fire management, they're sort of really lost the plot in regards how to look after volunteer firefighters for the first thing. And then definitely not willing to spend money on the regular burning and that. Like, it's almost, we haven't got a dollar for that. But it's not just in Queensland, it seems to be Australia wide that we're not doing that land management. But the government's not doing that land management, especially in their forest and in the land that they own. But they demand maximum obedience from landowners and landholders of private land, especially farmers. Now, just moving on to testing water quality, and that's where the topic of this is in regards to. All right, when you were in charge of the physics departments and the marine laboratory and that, you developed some technology in that for water quality. In regards to that, how much information can we get from a drop of water in the ocean?
Well,
depending where you get it from, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the instrumentation we developed showed that because we made the first instruments to be able to measure sediment concentrations in water and be able to do that for long periods of time, months, weeks or months. And we were able to show that the inshore reefs have got a lot of sediment there, and that sediment gets resuspended during whenever there's a southeasterly trade winds, which stirs up the waves, stirs up the bottom, and those inshore reefs get exposed to that. But the other thing you can show from some of this technology, which we worked on, was that, if you do imagine a drop of water in the Great Barrier Reef lagoon, one of the crucial things is how long will it stay in the lagoon before it's somehow back out in the Pacific Ocean? Because this determines whether pollution is going to build up. So, for example, a drop of water, if you drop it somewhere in Sydney Harbour, upstream from the bridge somewhere, it will take somewhere between 200 and 300 days before that drop of water might reach the Sydney heads and get out to sea. Now, this means that Sydney Harbour is very, very prone to pollution, because what we call the flushing time is very, very long. Now, it turns out that for the Great Barrier Reef, we did the measurements using different systems, and the flushing time is just a few weeks. So, you're talking vast quantities of water. The amount of water that flushes in and out of the Great Barrier Reef in just 8 hours is equal to all the water that flows down all the rivers on the whole coast in a whole year. Now, what this tells you is that with that flushing in just 8 hours, equivalent to all those rivers, it means that pollutants just can't build up within the Great Barrier Reef system. And this is one of the reasons why the water is so spectacularly clean, why you can't even measure the pesticides out on the reef. They go on about the farmers polluting the Great Barrier Reef pesticides. You can't even measure them. They're in such incredibly low concentrations. And I'm talking with, the most ridiculously sensitive equipment down at parts per trillion level. You still can't measure it. So those are the sorts of things these are well known, but you will never find these sorts of facts in the main documents which tell you, the government tells you about the reef, which they just want to tell you how bad it is when in fact it's in such a good state.
Well, the other thing is too, now we've already had the Land Management Act back in about 2017. Then we had the Reef Protection Act, and now you've got this reinvigoration of the government policing of those acts to ensure everyone obeys and knows that they're out there in force. The thing that sort of bothers me, I'm a householder, and I reckon I use more pesticides and herbicides than per acre than any farmer would, because I'm continually down Bunnings buying up Roundup or something to kill the weeds on the property, because they just grow so profusely in that. So how do we tell how good the farmers are doing versus how good the suburban environments? Because a suburban environment, it's got dog poo, cat poo, you've got people fertilizing their garden, they've got people poisoning their weeds, and you've got all sorts of stuff going down the drain out to sea. How do we tell the difference between something that's come out that's sort of come from an urban environment versus come from a farmer, and we only whack the farmer?
Well, you're right. We only whack the farmer. Now, it turns out on this coast that if you add up all people like you putting a bit of Roundup around, it doesn't add up to anything like what the farmers put on, right? So the farmers are the big source of nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides. But when you actually get out onto the reef, or even on the inshore reefs, they are never in an exceedance. So pesticides, even on the very close inshore reefs, they never get to a technical environmental exceedance of those things. So they don't even get to even a minor effects level on most of the reefs. But then out on the Great Barrier Reef, which is a long way off the coast, they're completely not there. All right. So it doesn't matter whether the farmers are more or less than the householder. It's just not there. But you do raise a good point, because there are some reefs which are close to an enormous city where, which nobody ever speaks about. You probably can't even think what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the reefs in Moreton Bay, just near the mouth of the Brisbane River, just near the Brisbane airport, where you've got this city, and with all the Gold Coast and all the stuff around it, of a couple of million people, and all the, as you say, dog poo and stuff, rubbish from tires on the road and all this type of stuff, washing out within just a few kilometers of one of the biggest rivers on the coast, the Brisbane River, draining the biggest metropolitan area. And those reefs are fine, okay? So they get way, 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 way more than any reef on the Great Barrier Reef. There's no reef regulations on the Moreton Bay reefs. It's only for the farmers, okay? But those reefs are actually doing fine. The only problem that the Moreton Bay reefs have is it gets too cold in winter. And you never know, if we get a bit of good global warming, we might be able to fix that for those reefs too. But they're certainly in good shape, and that's good proof that our reefs are not being affected by pesticides or fertilizer either.
In regards to sediment getting washed out to the sea, we just had a major rain event after Cyclone Jasper, and that basically affected the outputs of the Russell and the Mulgrave River, Barron, Daintree, Mowbray.
Yeah.
So we had a fair bit of brown water going out.
Can I say something about that? Because we did a lot of work on river plumes, but you also had a cyclone go over the top of you, right? Now you got some brown river plumes, but I guarantee you, it's a shame there were no instruments, but when we've had instruments where cyclones have either near missed or gone over our instruments, you will have 10 or 100 times more sediment resuspended off the bottom by the enormous waves than will come down the river plumes. The river plumes, yes, they look dirty, and they are dirty, but it's nothing compared with the amount of sediment. I'm predicting in a couple of weeks, there's going to be these reports of corals are going to be dying on the inshore reefs near Port Douglas and Mossman, places like that, okay? And they're going to say it was a sediment, and it's all because it's coming out of the farms, right? And it will be complete and utter baloney, just like it always is. Because they actually had the cyclone effectively go right over them, it would have resuspended the seabed down to, easily 10 centimeters of sediment would have been churned up right around those reefs, right? But that's probably not what would have killed any coral, and some coral will die. What will kill those coral is the sheer volume of fresh water that's come out of all those rivers. Because the one thing that coral just cannot take is not sediment, it's not pathetic amounts of pesticides or nutrients, it's fresh water. That kills corals pretty well stone dead every time. That's going to be the big killer of coral. So let's wait and see what happens, but that's my prediction.
Well, here's an interesting thing. We've just had a review of the Bradfield scheme, and if you go through, it's about 130 pages or so. And just in one part, there's a section, and it says the reason why we can't entertain a Bradfield system is because we've got to keep our environmental river flows. and there's a little table there, and what they're trying to say is environmental and the river flow should be maintained between 93 and 97% of river flow at end of river. Now, if you're doing that, you're pumping a lot of stuff out to sea, and you're almost making it impossible for people to live on the land if you expect them to survive in agriculture and even in townships with potable water on 3% of the river flow.
Well, that's right. And, the thing about northern rivers is they're incredibly peaky. The Burdekin River will be literally flowing as strong as the Amazon River when it's in flood. And then you can go over it at the end of October and there's no water in it at all. So, you can actually make the river flows much more reliable with dams, in fact, if you want to. Now, that isn't necessarily an argument for or against the Bradfield scheme, but it sort of ignores the fact that our rivers are very peaky. And what are you going to have 93% of? The peak, the average, the median, the low point? What is it going to be?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing I didn't quite understand about I did understand what the paper was about. It was basically saying you're not going to get any dams. There's not going to be any development in northern Queensland in this area. But as you just said, we would be much better if we actually controlled the river, so we didn't have this massive rush and bust cycle, and manage the water flow a lot better. With dams, weirs, and all those sort of things, it would be good for the internal environment because water is life.
I don't know whether you can say it's good for the environment. It will be a different environment. It may not be an environment that you want. I mean, I rather like the rivers the way they are, but I'm not, let's not make the case that the Bradfield scheme is a disaster environmentally. Really doesn't add up to much unless you're doing things like pumping from one catchment to another. That is a little bit dicky in terms of, the biosecurity side of things, that you take stuff from one catchment to the other. But I think, you're right. Look, a lot of the stuff on the Bradfield scheme and the Hell's Gate thing didn't make sense scientifically. So, for example, with Hell's Gate, they said we've got to stop Hell's Gate because we've got to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And you think, well, actually, Hell's Gate Dam will reduce the amount of sediment going out towards the Great Barrier Reef. Now, I would argue it doesn't make any difference anyway, but if it's going to make any difference at all, it will be better for the reef because there'll be a little less sediment going out there, maybe. So a lot of these arguments, they're not based on science, they're based on ideology. They decide they don't want something to happen, and then they just make it up, and they use the facade of science and the cover of the scientific organizations, which in many cases are effectively corrupted by what's been going on.
In regards to marine environments, how dependent are they on water coming out from the land? Is there a level of nutrients that the sea needs from the land to help things along, or be better off with no water entering it, or what is the case for the
Look,
novice?
the inshore regions along this coast have large amounts of nutrients, which have essentially been trapped next to the coast, maybe in the mud that's on the bottom. So you've got very large amounts of mud and sediments on the bottom, and the waves resuspend that and release the nutrients. The water goes green. You'll notice the coastal regions, especially near Cairns, the water's, if it's not brown, it's green. It goes a bit turquoise, but it's not that sparkling blue that you get out on the Great Barrier Reef. That's because of the nutrients, right? Now, if you turned off all the rivers on this coast, you just dammed them all and never let a single drop get out there, after maybe 1,000 years, all the mud would eventually be dissipated. The water would become much clearer, a bit like maybe the reefs of New Caledonia or somewhere like that, the inshore reefs of New Caledonia. But that takes a very long time. These inshore regions are mostly dominated by nutrients from wave resuspension, but there is a certain amount, a small amount that comes down from the rivers. But it's really about 1% of the nutrient cycling in the nearshore zone is from the rivers. It's very, very small.
So basically, the marine environment can survive without land water. Or is there essential things like estuarine environments that are important to the overall cycle of marine life?
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to just completely stop the water going out the Burdekin or the Johnson River or something like that. You definitely wouldn't want that. But it's pretty well impossible that, I mean, we've already got a big dam on the Burdekin. It goes over pretty quickly. The thing about the Burdekin is it's such a big river that it's hard to catch everything that goes down the Burdekin River.
Just highlighting it in regards to river control and that. I see it I look at the Ord River scheme. I come from Western Australia, and I've been interested in that for a long time. I mean, some people say it's been an economic white elephant in regards to the expectations, what it was supposed to deliver for farming and things like that. But a lot of that was also because we didn't have the expertise in regards to growing things in that environment. It was a fairly harsh. They had problems with insects in the first instance and that. But one of the things that interesting come out of the Ord River scheme is the two dam situation. You had the major dam holding the Lake Argyle in, which has got, I think now they've put the wall up. It's about 17 Sydney harbours, and then you've got the irrigation dam from about 55 kilometres down. Now, they can maintain that 55 kilometres of stretch at a constant level, and they basically do, and that gives irrigation off and tourism on that 55 kilometre length. But then the irrigation dam further downriver, that really is the mechanism to provide the irrigation to the greater agricultural thing. But one thing it has proven by maintaining this 55 kilometre stretch at a constant level is the spread out of wetlands. And we've seen the re-establishment of huge numbers of bird life, migratory birds, and not only have we got the numbers of birds back but we've also added to the number of species that can be maintained in that area. So, and that's just looking at the bird life, which is fairly easy to do. But there's also belief that the flora life and other sort of animals has increased at many folds as well. So there can be mutual benefits from river control.
Yep. I mean, one of the things you're sort of pointing out is there's this, I don't know, assumption that nature is perfect as it is and it cannot be improved. Now, I think what you've described in the Ord River, by keeping that level the same, and if the level goes up and down, it's not so good, but if the level is the same, then yes, you can actually have far more biodiversity, far more, life forms just better, right? Rather than desert, which occasionally gets a flood, you can actually get things that are better. there are many things you can do to the ocean, actually. I mean, it's a bit off topic, but if you sprinkle iron dust on large parts of the ocean, you get you get a bloom of phytoplankton, because large parts of the ocean don't have enough iron in them. So should you do that? You know, we get a blooming of life. Is that something which we should do? It's not obvious to me that you shouldn't do that, but there's this assumption that you mustn't play with nature at all, that it cannot be improved at all. Now, I'd agree, don't play with it unless you pretty well understand what you're doing. But I do think there are things that can be done that actually are better.
Well, but we seem to be going through this phase now, and we've probably been going through it for the last nearly 20 years, this anti-humanism in regards to the environment. I don't quite get it. I know there are some pockets of nature that are so pristine and so beautiful that they're worth preserving as they are. But I can tell you what, I've been across that Nullarbor bloody about 15 times back and forth driving it in my life, because I was in the Defence Force and getting posted all around. And there's a lot out there. I wouldn't mind if you put it under 5 foot of water.
No, well, look, I agree. There's, you know, a question that I'd often ask my students is, if you had the ability to make half of the Sahara Desert into a tropical rainforest, would you do it? And I did it just to, you know, just to stir them up. And it was amazing how many people would say no, they would not do it. They'd rather it was as the Sahara Desert, a barren wasteland, right? But that it's actually a value judgment. There's no science involved in that. It's a value judgment as to what is the better thing. But I think you're right. It comes down to a worshipping of the environment, sort of this Gaia type of thing. And it's gone too far. That it's yeah, we have gone too far in that regard.
I think that was what I was trying to point out is water is life, and if you can maintain a pond of water somewhere for a substantial time and guarantee that it's going to be there, life will life will turn up. Things will grow, animals will get attracted, birds get attracted, but it's as though we don't want to even be involved in the betterment of the planet by humans. It's all got to be done a la natural.
I think that's right, and there are things that you can do to make things better. But what probably worries me more than that is that all the things which we don't do, which are making things worse, and the fire management is a huge deal, where we are destroying large areas of Australia by not burning. The problem with the woody weeds, what I mentioned before about the 40-mile scrub, it's just a tiny little microcosm of what's happening all over the place. I think that's a bigger problem, that we're not managing things enough. It's not that we're not trying to improve things. We can do those things in just a few small areas, but we're actually going backwards in some areas. And then we're worrying about the Great Barrier Reef, which doesn't have any feral animals, doesn't have any invasive plants or pests, hasn't lost a single species. We haven't lost a single reef. Has never had more coral on it. We spend, you know, $500 million on it, and yet we can't look after these areas simply because we just couldn't be bothered.
But it's not just because we couldn't be bothered. There is now a mindset, basically, like even people who live down on the east coast, down in the southeast, like Vega and that, who are basically built their house in a firebox, and they get all upset if there's going to be controlled burning and they don't want it. I mean, how have we got to this situation where people with this emotive sort of output, and also with the help of so-called experts saying, well, we've got to preserve the forest as it is because we've got to protect the coral, and yet they say, well, we won't do any burning, but then they jump up and down when there's a big fire like in 2019 and 20, and just about roasted every live marsupial in around that southwest area. And it's going to take a long time for that wildlife to make a return. I mean, the trees will make a return, but they're again not as good as they were.
But don't you think part of the problem here is the corruption of the scientific institutions? Because these are the people, the biologists, the CSIRO, who should be saying what we're doing at the moment is madness. We're changing Australia forever with far more trees in many places than we've ever had before. Hot burns, which are incredibly destructive, absolutely not the way the Aboriginal people used to do things. Where are the science institutions in this debate? They're just saying, oh, well, you know, it's all climate change. The reason we've got all these fires, they're missing from action because they've become corrupted, they've become ideological, they've become much worse than useless, in fact.
Well, the thing that concerns me is people with 40 odd years expertise that have been around, you know, and did the forestry course. You know, I mean, the Australian National University is probably the home of some of the best forest managers in Australia over the years. There used to be in the field experts, you know, they weren't sitting in Sydney or Canberra or Melbourne or whatever. They actually had field officers out in the bush and that, and they were involved and had this knowledge. But even when we have submissions to Parliament for some law that's coming through, their expertise seems to amount to nothing compared to something from the Conservation Society or something like that, you know, which basically wrote the legislation in the first place for the government.
That's true. But if you look at the stuff coming out of, you know, the various at the tops of various departments, I'm not sure what CSIRO does on that type of stuff. They're not giving good advice. So, you know, it's like the situation with the reef. Everybody thinks the reef is terrible. Well, that's because the scientists have said that. They're the ones who have caused the problem because they've become corrupted and unreliable. And it's the same with the forest problem, the fire problem. It's the same with the fisheries problem, that the fisheries scientists have become corrupted. They're running models which don't make any sense. They tweak the parameters to get the answer they want, which is let's cut the fishery by another 50%. So we have this massive problem that our scientific fraternity, especially when it comes to anything vaguely environmental, is utterly corrupted and unreliable. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that. I think the whole climate change thing, where everything is now climate change, people are thinking, you know, they're just pushing this a little bit too hard. I'm not quite sure why, but I don't think this makes sense. I think that's what they're thinking. There was a remarkable poll that came out in America where Vivek Ramaswamy said that climate change has become a religion, and they did a poll on people, and 60% of people agreed that climate change has now become like a religion to be used to control us. That was the quote. Now, these might many be people who believe that climate change is a problem, but they can also see that the scientists are no longer acting as scientists. They're acting as ideologues and politicians, and that is a very bad place to be. We need our scientists to be trustworthy, but I wouldn't trust a scientist, you know, carte blanche from any institution now. I would have done 40 years ago, but I wouldn't now, because there's too many of them that have shown themselves to be ideologues, and too many of the organizations themselves have been shown to be corrupted and ideological.
The other thing is too, with the bureaucracy that overrules everything, they've got their own experts in there, of course. Do you think it's also a problem that the experts they rely on from that are in the bureaucracies and in the universities are no longer field people, and out there getting their hands dirty, counting the number of worms in the ground, counting the coral and those things? Is that a real problem? How can we sort of redress? Can we get the institution or another set of institutions that are only there out in the field and in the environment to give us good information? And how do we stop them from being eventually corrupted as well, because their money depends on providing a narratives?
Well, it's a good question. How do you reform them? Well, the first thing you've got to do is there's got to be a general realization that there is a corruption. It's not the normal corruption. It's not people should go to jail for it, but They're no longer reliable. There's got to be, if people know that their job doesn't rely on them doom sciencing all the time, that we will keep paying the Australian Institute of Marine Science, for example, no matter what. Why shouldn't we? We need to know about the Great Barrier Reef, but we want you to tell us the truth all the time. No ideology any of the time. That should be possible. You shouldn't necessarily to be able to get money from the Australian Research Council, have to always say, oh, the reef is doomed, or the echidna is doomed, or whatever you're studying is doomed. We want to actually encourage people and fund them to not do that. It must be possible to set this thing up. But it means that there's going to be somebody on top who's going to be kicking some asses, basically, saying, this is going to change. We are going to change. It's going to be a completely new broom, at least part of the science funding. And if you do that, and one way you can do that is by funding audits of the science. So you actually say, we want an audit on bushfire control, right? We don't care what's right. We just want to know what's wrong, right? And we've got $1 million, we need an audit done. And so you actually encourage scientists to be contrarian. At the moment, there's no career progression by being contrarian. That's the end of your career if you're contrarian. But you've got to make it so that it isn't. That means you must fund contrarians, fund audits, fund challenges. It's possible to do this.
Well, that goes back to the argument around about quality control of data.
Yeah.
And overseeing anything. Usually with most theories and that, they come out, but the first thing that happens, you get about 20,000 people trying to tell you that it doesn't work. The first thing they do is try to put a hole in your theory. Yeah. There's more people trying to put a hole in your theory than sort of support it. Is that sort of the thing? Well, let's have people testing out your data.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's good that, when Einstein, did his stuff with relativity, well, it took them a little while before they could do an experiment to try to prove or disprove it. But that was the first thing they did as soon as they could. And that's what you should do. That's the way science should work. But what ultimately can happen in science is the groupthink forms and the dissenters are excluded. That's actually the opposite of what you've just described. And that's exactly what happens. Dissenters like me just cannot survive in the present system. So there needs to be, I've often said we need an audit office, a science audit office, or we need the Minister of Agriculture for Queensland needs to set aside $10 million every year for doing audits on, are pesticides really a problem for the Great Barrier Reef? We've got $1 million. We want an audit done. We just want, throw rocks at the present theory.
Get some measurements.
If you can, yeah.
Get some measurements. But the thing is, we were warned about this way back in about 1961 when Eisenhower did his farewell speech to the American people. And I think it was one of the first televised ones. And he warned about the growth of, he was more pointing out to the military side of it, but the groupthink and the localization or the centralization of invention, basically. And he says, we're seeing the end of the tinker in the garage, the tinker and the thinker, basically, for this group thought. And he was quite strong in that speech in regards to, we've got to be on guard against this. If we don't, we'll be run by a totalitarian government as well.
Well, we're being run by the elites, which is what the scientific institution have had. I call them the nobility because elite means they're important, but the nobility, they have power. And they do have power over us. That speech by Eisenhower was remarkable. You're right, it was often quoted as the military-industrial complex. People worried about the military, but he also talked about the takeover of the scientists and, that they now had a lot of power even then. And it's grown way worse now. He was talking mostly in terms of military. But now, we spend far more money on environmental stuff than we do on our defense system. Way more money, right? So we've got all these so-called scientists, environmental scientists, with vast powers that can decide whether 40-mile scrub survives or doesn't, who decides, enormous amounts of money on various other things. And they're completely unchallenged at all. In fact, not only they're unchallenged, if you do challenge them, that's the end of you, basically. You're not allowed to challenge them. Very, very dangerous situation we've got into.
I think there should be much more reference to Eisenhower's speech, and it should be part of every sort of curriculum around the place, because I think it was so insightful, and the warnings were there, and we can see even the military. I mean, the F-35, I think, is the biggest clunker going, and it's because we've got our military into the US has got their military into one big pod, whereas you used to have about 10 different aircraft manufacturers coming out with all different designs and developments and innovations. But once you centralize it, well, then you only got this one pod system you're going. It's not a good way to go.
Maybe. I don't know a lot about I've heard a lot of stories about the F-35, but I no longer have a great deal of faith in any scientific institution, whether they're in defense or otherwise, because I think the same problems have crept even there. The sort of the wokeification, the creep of groupthink, it's pretty well pervasive. So I do worry about even defense science now.
Okay, look, we've gone over the hour. I'll just let you wrap up in regards to what your messaging is for the general layperson in regards to the Great Barrier Reef and what we need to just be a little bit aware of, and where we need to sort of have a bit more thought about the information that we receive.
Well, the Great Barrier Reef is brilliant, right? At the moment, it's brilliant. In a few years, it's not going to be so brilliant. The scientists will say, oh, we've lost half the coral, and you should just roll your eyes and say, untrustworthy scientists. We need our politicians to start spending some money, and this is money by the Department of Agriculture, Department of Science, to do audits on some of this environmental science, to really shine some heat, to put some heat on these institutions which have been largely corrupted by groupthink and ideology. That's what we've got to do.
Okay, Peter, look, if you can just stay on the line for a little bit, I'll just wrap the show up and then introduce our next show somewhere in the future. Thank you. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be taking a short break over the Christmas New Year period, but we'll be back early in the new year, probably mid-January. And first off, cab off the rank, I'll be talking again to Ken Jury, and we'll be looking at the restoration of estuarine environment to the lower lakes in South Australia, and see the cost, what's required, and the cost-benefit analysis for that. So please join me then in the early new year. Thank you.